Yeah. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone's faces. I would like to welcome Jane McLelland here, who's going to speak to us today about starving cancer. And I'll do a little introduction and then I'll turn it over to Jane. I know everyone here is very familiar with Jane, her work. She's been a trailblazer for many of us. So I'll just give a little introduction. Jane is a physiotherapist, a world-renowned author, a long-time stage 4 cancer thriver, and a modern-day Sherlock Holmes, as many has termed her. She beat cervical cancer, lung, and blood cancers using the missing link to defeat cancer by starving it. Jane has mapped the landscape of cancer metabolism in a new way that everyone can understand. She discovered that ketogenic diet and fasting diet, nutritional supplements, and off-label low-dose toxicity drugs, when taken together as a metabolic cocktail, act synergistically to kill even the toughest cancer. She is regarded as a modern-day cancer Sherlock Holmes. Her most famous contribution is the Metro Map of Cancer Metabolism. So without further ado, Jane, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And I seem to be, I've kind of lost myself on here. So I don't know where I pressed some view and I don't know where I am. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Hopefully everybody, can you see me? Because I can't see me.
Yeah, I can see you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I haven't got anything specific that I want to, I will cover a few topics that people want to discuss. So I do want to hear from you. I don't know whether we can put it in the chat or whether, you know, what specific things you want me to talk about. But I know that Gillian wants me to talk a little bit about the difference between a starve phase and a kill phase. I mean, I'd quite like to know if people are familiar with my book to start with, if people actually are familiar with the Metro Map, or do they want me to quickly just go through the kind of way that works? Shall I do an overview of?
Probably an overview. There's a few of us currently taking the course right now.
Right, okay. So let me just share. Right, I'm just going to go back to, hang on a sec. Okay. So much rubbish on my screen. Hang on. Got a million articles I'm researching at any time. Okay, let's look at this one. Right, so hallmarks of cancer. Very briefly, the hallmarks of cancer were sort of laid out by Hanahan and Weinberg in 2000 with a great number of sort of very confusing list of things. And it kind of didn't have, oh, where have I gone? It didn't really have a beginning or an end to it. So it was very confusing for anybody coming in and actually trying to understand cancer. There was no, how does it start and how does it become the fast dividing cell? So that was my job, was to try and dig down into the research and work out exactly what happens first. How does it transform into a cancer cell? And how does it then proliferate? And what causes it to do all that? So the Hanahan and Weinberg were basically the first ones were, thank you, Sam. Sorry, my son is bringing me a pancake, which I wasn't expecting. Thank you. So genomic instability, tissue inflammation were kind of the key factors that Hanahan and Weinberg were talking about with their hallmarks. And then a lot of these other things we can gloss over a little bit. But then in 2011, they realized they'd forgotten that actually this reprogramming of any energy metabolism was something that Otto Warburg had discovered back in the 1920s, and they had omitted it as kind of like a key fact in their hallmarks. And then, of course, the immune system wasn't really in there either. And it's a breakdown in the ability of the immune system to recognize the cancer cell, which allows it to proliferate and become the fast dividing, this fast dividing mass. But essentially, the really key thing that they had missed was the tumor microenvironment, or the oncobiome, which is the area around the cancer itself. And that's actually how cancer begins. It's a change in the microenvironment, or the terrain, that changes the way that the cell responds to its environment, and then it switches on all of these oncogenes. So the last thing that they realized was that metabolic flexibility, the ability for the cancer stem cell to switch and change from one pathway to another, was incredibly important, and the way that it resists treatment. So you cannot kill a cancer stem cell by just treating it with one thing on its own. It'll always find a different route, and it'll switch from one route to another, which is why I came up with my MetroMap. This is from my second edition, so some of you may not be familiar with all of these pathways, because there are more on there than my original MetroMap. I've added IGF-2. We've got more glutamine transport on there. PIN1 is particularly important for breast cancer, actually. That's quite key. And things like black walnut can be incredible, or juglone, as it's otherwise known, can be incredibly useful for helping to block breast cancer progression. So if we're going to focus on breast cancer a little bit, I think that should be in pretty much everybody's cocktail. The proteasome is kind of like a cellular dustbin, where it sort of dumps certain things into the bin, and things like the P53 can end up in the dustbin, which means you don't have the suppressor cells and the genes for suppressing cancer, and these kind of end up in the bin. mTOR, you're probably familiar with. That's kind of like the switchway. It's like a cellular keyboard, a central keyboard for sort of switching on the progression of cancer and the replication. Autophagy is something I think needs to be more fully explored, because this can be either anti-cancer or it can be pro-cancer. And that's the problem with autophagy. At some points, you want to be switching on autophagy, certain times like the kill phase with ferroptosis, or if you're using intravenous vitamin C, you actually want to encourage autophagy. In some cancers, and in particularly in HER2, for example, you want to be switching off autophagy unless you're doing a kill phase. So it's a little bit tricky, the whole autophagy side, and that's why it becomes a little bit more of a minefield to understand, because it does have this dual purpose. Nucleoside salvage is the ability to scoop up these nucleosides, which are little chunks of DNA. It's kind of like the opposite to the pentose phosphate pathway, which is on the right here. That creates
Jane, for a second. Jane?
Yeah. Yes.
Which slide are we supposed to be looking at?
Okay. Hang on. Shall I just
while you're speaking, are you referencing slide number 2? Okay.
Yes, I am. Can you see that now?
Yep.
Was that not visible?
It was. I just wasn't sure if you were referring to items.
All right. Sorry. I didn't have it displayed properly. Okay. So we have the pentose phosphate pathway on this side, which is creating chunks of DNA for new cells. So if you block this pathway, the pentose phosphate pathway, it will use the nucleoside salvage pathway as its alternate pathway. And you find that on all of these pathways, if you block one, there will be a corresponding pathway that it upregulates. And OXPHOS, for example, if you block that, it'll use more of the aerobic glycolysis, and vice versa. So if you block the glycolysis, it'll use more OXPHOS. And in fact, in breast cancer, you have different emphasis on some of these pathways. So in estrogen positive breast cancer, the emphasis is actually more on OXPHOS than it is on glycolysis. Whereas in HER2, you get much more emphasis on glycolysis and fat pathways and less on the OXPHOS. And in triple negative breast cancer, you actually get more emphasis on glutaminolysis and some of these fat pathways, fatty acid oxidation in particular, but you also get a little bit of glycolysis as well. So it's kind of a different picture that you get depending on the type of cancer you have. So it has a different phenotype, has a different way of expressing itself, and that's why you need different approach with every different cancer as to sort of which ones you focus on blocking primarily. And I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions on that so far. I think it will probably stop and allow questions as we go. Does that kind of make sense to people? Have they grasped that concept? I mean, there's probably things you don't understand in there. You may not understand what some of those pathways are, but
Jane,
any questions?
Jane, can you repeat the recommended vitamins that you suggested for breast cancer? You said the black walnut, and there was one other.
Oh, it's otherwise known as juglone. Yeah, so that's actually the same thing, juglone and black walnut for the PIN1 pathway, which is really dominant in all of the breast cancers. Very important. And then you got some variation with some of these things with different types of cancer. So the OXPHOS is more important in the estrogen positive. And then in HER2, you have more of an emphasis on glycolysis and fatty acid oxidation and fatty acid synthesis. But that's not to say that you're not going to look at these other pathways as well. And in fact, actually, autophagy is much more relevant in the HER2 breast cancers because they use that macropinocytosis pathway, which is why hydroxychloroquine can be particularly useful for HER2 breast cancers, and it really works alongside Herceptin to stop it becoming treatment resistant. And then the triple negative breast cancers, very much glutamine, fatty acid driven, but also a bit of glycolysis as well. So that's the main, but that's not to say that you don't cover some of the other things as well. And there are obviously other pathways that I haven't mentioned there, which are specific to breast cancers, because of course that's just my one of my hallmarks, which is the sort of metabolism. You've got all of these other hallmarks as well. So the abnormal cell signaling is really looking at the abnormal tumor microenvironment and the effect on the outside of that cell. So what's going on around the outside of that cell. And toll-like receptors are triggered by pathogens. So that means mostly you have, most people will have something called this oncobiome, which is a different, it's like having a microbiome in your gut, but it's a different oncobiome, which is the cancer, different pathogens around the breast cancer. So you have it's different to your normal cell. If you were going to compare one breast to another, they would have a completely different look and set up with their pathogens. So then that creates different signals going into the cell that fires different information into the cell, and that triggers this reaction to create a hunger inside the cell to make fat, to make glutamine, to make fatty acids. And it's not just about starving things people think about taking statins just to starve the cholesterol. It's not just about starving cholesterol. It's not just thinking about, oh, well, I've got a low cholesterol, I don't need to do it. That's not how it works. The actual cancer cell produces cholesterol to feed the metastases. So it's actually creating the cholesterol as a specific need to help it to spread to other areas. So it's actually, you don't need to see it so much as sort of trying to starve your body. You are trying specifically to starve the cancer cell. And I think people get a little bit confused with that, and they don't realize that, they may have a low cholesterol. That's not enough. You actually need to be starving the cancer itself as well. And certain breast cancers respond much better to statins. The triple negative breast cancers respond much better. Some of them are sort of a little bit more equivocal with the statins, but that's because some of them are using that SREBP2 pathway. If I go back here, you can see both the mevalonate pathway and the SREBP2 pathway. These are both cholesterol pathways. If you block one, it'll use the other one. And some of the cancers are more heavily using the SREBP2. And that means you should be using, well, I use dipridamol, not that I had breast cancer, but dipridamol will stop the SREBP2, and also a supplement called luteolin, which is quite a powerful antioxidant, in fact, and actually something you need to stop if you're going to try ferroptosis. So that's why you get this uptake of, you get this increase in production of mevalonate, but you also get this hunger for glucose. You get a hunger for the fatty acids, so it actually creates fatty acids, as well as breaking down fatty acids. It's a complex picture of breaking down and building up at the same time. And this creates growth factors, and these growth factors can then switch off the immune system. So transforming growth factor beta, for example, one of these growth factors will actually help switch off the good immune cells, and it'll trigger bad immune cells to be more upregulated, so that they actually cloak the cell, so it doesn't your body doesn't recognize the cancer as being non-you. And then it ends up being a fast cell division. Once the immune system has no control over your cancer, then it becomes the fast dividing cell. Any questions on that? No? Okie dokie.
Sorry, there's a question in the chat box, Jane, and the question is the MetroMap most important for people undergoing treatment at the same time? What about people who are in complete remission from 2 cancers?
Right. So from 2 cancers, what you mean, the same cancer that is spread, or?
No, she's listed, she had breast cancer and then another time had leukemia.
Right. Okay. So that means that there's probably cancer stem cells lurking around. And my suggestion would be to definitely use a cocktail to, certainly for a couple of years. It's very hard to know the sort of the time span at which you should be doing this for, in order to get it, under control and to feel confident that you've got the cancer stem cell under control. There doesn't, the research isn't there, sadly. So it's all a bit of guesswork as to how much you do. But certainly I would say that you would need to be at a minimum suppressing mTOR, which you do with the metformin. You need to be blocking both of these pathways, I would say, actually. So you need to be taking a statin and you need to be taking luteolin. You probably need to be blocking both aerobic glycolysis and OXPHOS at the same time. So metformin will cover the OXPHOS, plus I would say take a bit of berberine as well. And the glycolysis, there are certain supplements that you can take that can help with that. A slightly more expensive one is fermented wheat germ, but it covers quite a lot of those enzymes in that pathway. And melatonin in particular is quite good for blocking some of that as well. And I would definitely suggest melatonin for every breast cancer patient, irrelevant of their ER status, because it is so good, because it works on this pathway. So yes, I would definitely suggest doing a cocktail that blocks quite a lot of these things, and the glucose transport. Even glucosamine sulfate, which is a fairly common supplement that's used for joints and, you know, arthritic problems, that actually has some glycolytic inhibition as well. So it's very simple and a simple little addition, but I think it would be useful to be adding that into a cocktail too. I think it's possibly one of the reasons that my cancer, I didn't know about it blocking glycolysis until relatively recently, but I just thought it was a growth factor inhibitor because it blocks MMP3, one of those matrix metalloproteinases. But glucosamine sulfate is a really useful supplement to be adding in. And fatty acid synthesis here is actually very common in ER breast cancer in particular. You know, that's something that needs to be blocked. Aspirin and metformin together. There's been some research recently which shows that metformin on its own doesn't help breast cancer, and then they did another one recently that showed aspirin on its own doesn't help breast cancer. But they're not looking at the cocktail. These things work synergistically with other things. The same as anything, you take one thing, it's just not going to work. And I think Big Pharma are trying their best to try and quash the whole off-label revolution that's going on out there, and I think they're doing a damn good job with these ridiculous trials that are just looking at one drug at a time, and it's not the way that it works. You know, and I took, when you look at this map, I pretty much took something to block everything, I would say, on here, maybe bar about 2 of them. So yeah, it has to be a fairly comprehensive approach if you're going to stop full-blown cancer. But if you're going to just look at prevention, if you're at NED, Scutellaria, really good, bacolensis, that helps to block IGF-1 and is actually shown to have a lot of effects with breast cancer too. I'd say that is one of the things that would definitely be in my list. And also Dan Shen, which blocks some of these fat pathways, really useful too. So that's red sage. It's a Chinese herb.
I was about to say too, Jane, that we had last week we had Dr. Mendez from Cancer Care Oncology speak to us about off-label drugs and why they're important in terms of the metabolic cocktail that you referred to. So I think there's a lot of questions around the different supplements and when you take them and how not to like overload your system. And I know I experience this myself because I have so many that I take.
Yeah, I know. And it can become overwhelming to the point where you then just stop because you can't bear to take them anymore. And I did actually, you know, I learned to take them by, I would make myself a really nice juice. Mine was very much carrot, apple. You don't have to have too much carrot. I mean, I went a lovely shade of orange. But I did have a nice juice that I would try and meditate slowly as I took my pills, just with my juice, and just make it into a key part of my day and not something I had to do. It was, I just tried to make it more of an experience so that it wasn't such a chore. And I think it's important to try and look at taking your pills like that. Otherwise it does become impossible. And it becomes really hard to keep going with the program. But certainly supplement overwhelm is a big problem. And it's finding supplements that will target lots of different things in the same way that sort of we try and get the drugs to be what's known as pleiotropic, so that they hit lots of different targets at the same time. You want supplements that will do that too. So, you know, berberine was thank God, one of my choices. I didn't know anyone else taking berberine when I was taking it. It seemed to be completely new to me. I'd only just found the research, and I just managed to find Mahonia aquifolium, which contained the berberine, but it also contained berberine, oxycanthine, the full spectrum of ingredients in it that I felt was useful for helping to block the cancer. So, and it had great effects on the microbiome, which we know is really useful in helping your immune system to overcome the cancer as well. I think checking your gut is something that people don't pay enough attention to. And I did the full Genova diagnostics, and I do encourage people to actually go and try and get that done, because it is quite revealing. I didn't know I had a parasite, and getting rid of that, I think, was pretty much instrumental in helping me get better. Otherwise, you're kind of fighting this uphill battle all the time. You're constantly fighting a problem. And if you don't know what those problems are, then you can't ever make headway. So I do think it's important to get those things checked, in the background. The microbiome is becoming more and more important. Lots more work and research on that coming out. And, the importance of particular strains of probiotics in the gut. Any more questions on the Metro map?
I have a question for you. How do we know with the different types of supplements that you can take, for example, berberine, what the right amount is and when to take it?
Yeah, well, that's a very tricky question, because it does depend a little bit on what you're trying to achieve. So, I mean, if you think of berberine as being very similar in a way to metformin, traditionally speaking, as a diabetic drug, you'll be told to take it with food, because that's how diabetics are told to take it, so that it stops the release of the glucose from the food after, 20 minutes after you've eaten. But in fact, actually, with metformin, if you take it in a fasted state, it will work far better than taking it with food. So it's a different approach in cancer to if you're taking it as a diabetic. And they've shown that, you can, because metformin is blocking OXPHOS, this pathway here, and intermittent fasting will help block glycolysis. And you want to be blocking both, because suddenly it works, as opposed to, metformin on its own doesn't work. But if you use metformin on an empty stomach, and say you're intermittent fasting and you're not eating until midday, if you take the metformin last thing at night, first thing in the morning, you're taking it during that intermittent fasted state. And probably the same with berberine as well, I would suspect, because they are so similar in many respects. So I would say that actually, don't be concerned, as long as you haven't got, a lot of people get gut issues when they're taking metformin, but that's because the microbiome may be a bit off. So it's not really that conducive to, taking the metformin will actually improve the microbiome, improve the amount of Akkermansia, which is the type of gut bacteria that you need. But it takes time, and you can have gut issues for a couple of months until your gut adjusts and improves. But I think it's worth sticking out. A lot of people give up metformin too early, but it's worth persevering. And the same with berberine. You don't get quite as many side effects with the berberine, but you can still get that diarrhea or tummy upset, but definitely worth persevering. But every other supplement, I would say, probably you can take it on an empty stomach. It's about blocking the nutrient uptake to the cancer cell. Mostly, I would take it at meal times, because you want to stop the nutrients that you've just taken into your body getting to the cancer. And it's all about, the access that the cancer has and how it uses it. But actually, having said that, statins are best taken in a fasted state. So that's why they're taken last thing at night. Again, you can take it first thing in the morning if you're finding it hard to sleep with your statin. But yeah, the majority, I'd say, because you might feel a bit nauseous taking too many things on an empty stomach. I know that green tea makes me feel particularly nauseous if I'm taking it on an empty stomach. So I have to be a little bit careful about how I take that. In terms of dosage, I have got a list of dosages. If you've done my online course, I've got sort of the key supplements and drugs at the end of the course in module 13. There's a PDF that you can download and print out. It hasn't got the timings of how you do that. As I'm not a doctor, I shouldn't be telling anybody how much or when. So that's not part of my remit, really. But I've taken what doctors suggest and put it into a PDF at the end of my online course if people want to look at that. I updated it a few weeks ago. So if you've not seen it recently, you might want to download it again. Hope that helps. Any other questions on that? Do you want me to talk more about what should we talk about?
Jane, can you talk about timed exercise?
Yeah. Okay, let's just come out of this for a minute. I'll just stop the share for a sec. So, okay, so we'll talk about exercise. Essentially, there are two ways that you can use exercise. It's a bit like any other aspect of my course. It's sort of like either starving your cancer or you use it to oxygenate and kill, okay? So people can try and visualize the difference between a starve phase where you can use antioxidants, you can use different ways to actually starve the cancer cell by blocking those pathways, or a kill phase, which is raising oxygen-free radicals and trying to create a pulse of oxygen in the cancer. So that requires a much more intense exercise. So high intensity interval training is a really good way of boosting that oxygen uptake, and you can use certain supplements and certain supplements like ashwagandha, danshan, the piperlongumine, which blocks the XCT antiporter. All of those things will actually increase the free radicals and make that kill phase much more effective, whereas you can have certain antioxidants which may negate the effect of exercise. I talk about this in my online course specific to prostate cancer, where they showed that drinking pomegranate juice completely negated the effect of exercise with prostate cancer patients. So you could be doing fantastic amounts of exercise, drinking pomegranate juice individually, they look like they are both going to synergize and increase the effects. Actually, they cancel out each other, so you end up with no beneficial effect from doing it at all, which is a disaster, you know, because most prostate cancer patients love the pomegranate, and they know that's great for their prostate cancer. They also know that exercise is absolutely top, you know, for them. And to think that they're doing both of those and actually getting nowhere must be really quite depressing. But the reason for that is because you've got ellagic acid, you've got luteolin, you've got lots of ingredients in the pomegranate which are really antioxidants. So it's completely taking away the oxidant or the pro-oxidant effect that you're trying to get from the exercise. So it's just cancelling the two out. So it's really critically important to know whether you're using antioxidants in particular ways. Now, that with exercise and with intravenous vitamin C in particular, you need to make sure that you're not taking antioxidants that are actually knocking out the beneficial effects of what you're doing. And supplements that will do that, so ellagic acid, luteolin, genistein, which I don't recommend for ER positive breast cancer patients at all, can be useful for triple negative, but I'll be very wary about it for estrogen positive. And then, so we've got, ellagic acid, luteolin, genistein. Green tea can be on its own can scoop up some of these iron radicals, and you actually want to increase the iron to be oxidized during the times that you're doing this. So that can actually be not beneficial. Whereas if you have EGCG on its own, or a sort of an 80 or 90% strength concentration strength supplement, that can actually increase the free radicals. So that's a good thing to have with your oxygen therapies. But green tea may actually, again, negate some of the effects. And melatonin can be a problem because that's a really major antioxidant. So that can actually negate some of the effects of what you're trying to do as well. So it's a tricky one, because at high dose, it may be pro-oxidant, but there's, again, not enough research to show at what level, you know, how much do you need of a dose to be pro-oxidant. This is all still, you know, we're at the cutting edge of this at the moment, and the research just isn't there yet. So I can't be absolutely definitive about what I'm saying here in terms of what's okay and what's not in terms of dosage. But certainly a low dose of melatonin can prevent a proper kill phase.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jane. Just to clarify, during the kill phase, when you're exercising with high intensity training, you're bringing oxygen to the cells, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So what you don't want to do is consume antioxidants during that time, because you're canceling it out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And that makes it very tricky, because how soon before do you stop? How soon afterwards can you start? You know, I mean, it's a very tricky, I don't know all the answers to this. All I can tell you is that, you know, if you're taking pomegranate juice and having exercise, you're not going to get any benefit. So you've got to make sure on the days where you are doing high intensity exercise that you are certainly making sure that you are taking things like piperlongumine, which will reduce the glutathione in the cell, because it's blocking cysteine uptake. Cysteine makes glutathione, and the glutathione is your major antioxidant in the cell. So the antioxidant there is created by the cysteine. So N-acetyl cysteine is something that needs to be avoided if you're trying to do any kind of kill phase, other than chemo. Sometimes it's okay with chemo. Chemo is different because it'll damage your healthy cells as well as your cancer cells, and you actually want to mitigate that risk a little bit. And particularly as doctors tend to overdose us all with chemo, you know, they give us the maximum tolerated dose, which frankly is a shocker for all of us. So we want to be taking things that actually knock that back a little bit, because we actually want to be protecting our healthy cells. So having chemo as a kill phase, even though it's creating those free radicals, you don't have to be quite so stringent in trying to look at what you're trying to stop, because you want to try and protect your healthy cells as well. So if you're doing intravenous vitamin C and exercise in particular, you've got to, you know, high intensity exercise, you've got to be very careful not to have too many antioxidants. But if you're having chemo, because of the damage that you get to your healthy cells, it's not quite so critical, and you can afford to take some of these antioxidants because they have an effect on starving the cancer cell at the same time. It'll actually make the chemo work better. So it's a different approach. That's probably a very roundabout way of explaining it, and I don't know if I've made any sense there at all, but I probably lost a few of you, but hopefully you can see the difference there between antioxidant and oxidant. Antioxidant you can use in the starve phase, and in the kill phase you're looking very much for pro-oxidant. Okay.
I've recently been on this vitamin C infusion train. I'm really interested in it, and it's shocking that in our area, in the Washington DC area, I mean, it's really hard to find a place where you can go for this.
Right.
And we had some communication, you and I, Jane, a few months back about it. And what do you recommend in terms of if somebody was going to have a consultation, what sort of questions should they ask? And what is sort of the recommended dose? Because there seems to be, my first consultation that I went to, there was, I mean, there were all sorts of options and things you can add in. And I'm
Yeah.
so glad that I asked you about it, because they were suggesting that I add in the antioxidant to
Yeah.
the cocktail. So can you speak a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So, well, it's a shocking dilemma that we don't have more intravenous vitamin C available. You know, it's quite clear that it's been very beneficial for cancer patients, because it's not just a pro-oxidative approach, it's actually cutting off some of that glycolysis as well. So it's a really useful treatment to have. And actually, you know, I would love, I'm hoping one day I'm going to have some ferroptosis clinics. So I'm looking at starting one in the UK. Maybe I can start one out near Washington. I don't know. But, you know, it's something I want to work with doctors to create the correct approach using intravenous vitamin C, making it more effective and making sure that we're not negating the benefits of it, and we're maximizing the efficacy of it by having the correct cocktail. And certainly ferroptosis seems to be the way to make it the most effective. And this is using iron and the oxidative effect of intravenous vitamin C to trigger cell death. And it's a different form of cell death to apoptosis. But you need to make that effective by having the correct dose of vitamin C, certainly a minimum, I would say, of 50 grams for anyone, but it can range between 1 gram per kilo to 1.5 grams per kilo as the average kind of dose to have if you're going to have intravenous vitamin C. And you can have things like, you see, this is where it changes, because you have, with vitamin C, at low dose, it's antioxidant, but at high dose, it's pro-oxidant. And you have the same thing with alpha lipoic acid, which at low dose is antioxidant, but you have it intravenously at a high dose, it becomes pro-oxidant. So, you know, and that's where you've got to understand the differences between what you're having and how it changes. And this is where I think maybe melatonin at high dose would be pro-oxidant as well. So maybe you wouldn't have to stop it if you were doing a high dose of it. I don't know. Very hard to know with the melatonin. But certainly it's important to make sure that, you know, you are not taking things like N-acetylcysteine or the glutathione at the same time, because that's just negating the effect of the intravenous vitamin C. And a lot of practitioners used to give the two together. And I know the Reardon clinics still give glutathione sometimes the day after. That's different to actually doing it on the day. So yeah, it's very tricky because everybody has their own view and there are different ways of doing things. But one day I will have a ferroptosis clinic. I'm sure of it. Does that make it any clearer with the vitamin C or not really? If you want to know other things that will help it.
How often do you recommend? I've heard all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, again, it depends, you know, there's so many, everybody's different. So the kill phase could be something you have to do. If you've got pancreatic cancer, you might want to do 5 days straight of intravenous vitamin C. If you've got a sort of fairly under control cancer, you might only want to do it once a month. Most people want to look at doing it probably once a week, I would say. You don't have to do it. I mean, a lot of practitioners say 2 or 3 times a week, but if you're going to do it the once and do it really effectively, that may be enough rather than 2 or 3 times and not get it right. So it is all about getting the right combination of supplements in there and other drugs that can actually help it. Disulfiram, which is it's an anti-alcohol drug. It gives you the most shocking hangover if you were to take it. And and have alcohol at the same time. But disulfiram is a really good drug for triggering those free radicals in breast cancer, and could be something that you can use alongside vitamin C to make it much more effective as well. And there are quite a few drugs that will actually help. So nitazoxanide, which is an anti-parasitic drug, that stops glutathione peroxidase, which is one of the enzymes. So that again helps to raise the level of oxidation. So yeah, EGCG as a supplement, a fairly pure supplement, rather than having it with the green tea, is good. And sulforaphane, I was a bit worried about sulforaphane to begin with, and I've kind of said don't do it in my book, but actually I've changed my mind because it has this dual effect. So it'll block the XCT antiporter, which means it'll increase the pro-oxidant level in the cell. It's blocking cysteine getting into the cell, but it also activates NRF2, which is a detox pathway. So I was a bit worried because NRF2 will block the effects of the intravenous vitamin C, and I didn't want that. But actually it blocks the XCT antiporter as well, which is greater. So it actually helps intravenous vitamin C more than it hinders. So I was a bit concerned because it had this effect of actually blocking the effects, but actually it promotes it more than it blocks it. So and on the basis of that, sulforaphane is such a brilliant supplement to add in. I would suggest that everybody have sulforaphane in their cocktail. It's such a powerful thing to have. And danshen is also, again, something that will actually help the intravenous vitamin C work better as well. And not only that, I mean, it is one of my top recommendations for all breast cancers, actually, because it blocks that fat import. It blocks the uptake of particular oils. And the other thing to remember is that you need the correct oils when you're going through intravenous vitamin C. It needs to change from oils that sort of are antioxidant to pro-oxidant oils. So oils that will oxidize readily in the presence of oxygen, because you want the cells to, the cell membranes, which are made of fat, to oxidize and break down. That's what causes the cells to die. And you want to swap from things like olive oil to flaxseed oil and fish oils, but particularly cod liver oil, because that doesn't contain vitamin E. Vitamin E is one of the things you should absolutely avoid if you are trying to do intravenous vitamin C. It's too antioxidant. It's kind of like the key thing that you need to avoid, along with NAC. So those are the
and Jane, these list of vitamins, I'm in the middle of doing your course right now. Those are at the end of the course.
Yeah, they're in. I've got the kill phase module. I might update my ferroptosis because I'm learning more about it all the time. And things like the sulforaphane, which I was worried about, actually is pro rather than anti. You know, it has this effect where it blocks the XCT antiporter, so it's making it work rather than blocking it. So yeah, I need to do an update. Curcumin as well at high dose is probably pro-oxidant, so that's probably okay. I was a bit concerned about that too because it can chelate iron. So there are things that I've changed my mind on. Chrysin as well, which is another supplement that is really useful for things like blocking hypoxia, which is the lack of oxygen. So it's actually pro intravenous vitamin C. So if people know what chrysin is, CHRYSIN, it's found in propolis in bee products, and it's a really good one, particularly actually for triple negative breast cancer. Chrysin is really good for that. It should definitely be in somebody's protocol if they got TNBC. I'm just trying to think of other things that you should stop. Indole 3-carbinol, actually, because yeah, that can actually stop ferroptosis, even though it's very similar in some respects to sulforaphane. They are different in how they affect the intravenous vitamin C. I would actually stop the indole 3-carbinol on the day of intravenous vitamin C and focus on the sulforaphane. But very often you get those two, they come in the same pot, you know, they're mixed together very often. But I would actually try and make sure you have the sulforaphane on its own so that you can have that separately on the intravenous vitamin C days and stop the indole 3-carbinol. But that's a really important one for breast cancer for the STAR phase. It's just for days that you're having intravenous vitamin C. Any more questions on that? Any? Oh, and the other thing is Scutellaria, that bacolensis, hugely inhibiting for ferroptosis. So again, you need to stop that if you're going to have intravenous vitamin C. So that's another no-no. So there is a long list of things that are actually too antioxidant. So, okay, we have a question, is olive oil okay? Yeah, I use one called the Governor, which comes from Southwest Corfu, and it has a very high level of hydroxytyrosol and oleocanthal. And those two things are very good for anti-cancer, anti-Alzheimer's, it has really good beneficial effects generally. But this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, because actually you want to encourage autophagy during vitamin C as well. So rather than blocking autophagy, which is what the olive oil does with these ingredients, you actually want to encourage autophagy. So again, it's a bit of a swap change to what you'd normally do. And particular oils like black seed oil, which again contains something that blocks autophagy, you want to stop that and you want to swap to an oil which will oxidize. So generally speaking, they are brilliant during a STAR phase, but people have got to understand that the STAR phase is different to the kill phase, and they are separate and shouldn't really be mixed too much. There's a lot of things you can starve, the cysteine right the way through with things like piperlongumine, the sulforaphane. They're great to have all the time, but you just want to be stopping certain things for a kill phase and promoting that oxidant activity in the cell. But yeah, certain oils need to be stopped on intravenous vitamin C days, not necessarily on chemo days, but on intravenous vitamin C days, I would stop the olive oil. But generally speaking, it's great, and particularly for HER2. Actually, it works particularly well for HER2 breast cancer. So other oils, do you want to think about other oils that will help? Walnut oil will help on intravenous vitamin C days, because that again oxidizes quite readily. And other oils to stop. Yeah, no, just avoid sunflower oil is the worst. Do not ever let sunflower oil go past your lips, because it's bad news. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. But that's the worst one. Yeah, it's a list of stuff. Hope people have.
I think it's really beneficial. I realized, I've a few years ago I picked up your book, and that really inspired me on the journey that I'm on now, with blocking metabolic pathways. And I found that once I started your course, the online course, it really has helped me.
Yeah, and explain it much better than I'm explaining it now.
Well, no, but I mean, it gives me a little bit of context, because it can be kind of heavy, right? In terms of the terminology and
yeah. Yeah, but it's kind of important to understand what these things are. That's the problem, is that the oncologist doesn't understand it, and you've got to make the effort to do it yourself because they don't. And you've got to understand why it's important to know whether you're blocking autophagy or not blocking it or trying to stimulate it, or whether you're using certain fats at a particular time or not, or whether you're using antioxidants at a particular time or going pro-oxidant. All of those things are really important to try and grasp. And yeah, it is complicated. But you know, I will do. I'm just about to do. I'm doing an article with Life Extension magazine. They're going to be discussing my ferroptosis, and we're doing a sort of a précis of my chapter at the back of the book. So that'll be helpful for people as well if they haven't got my second edition yet, but it doesn't do the full explanation of what you should and shouldn't take, but it will give a good overview of it. And I think I probably do need to redo my ferroptosis module in the you know, that video I've done in the online course. I think I need to redo that, just make it a bit clearer, because things have changed, and you know, you discover things and go, okay, I can update that. And that's the beauty of what I've done with the online courses. They are short videos. You can just do 5-minute quick watch, move on to the next one, but that does give me the ability to go in there and redo it, which I think is important, because things change and you learn things, and you know, I'm constantly learning things, and you know, I'm constantly trying to look for the next thing that's going to be the big thing to help. And I think that ferroptosis was that big thing. And you know, the immunotherapies synergize really well with the ferroptosis protocol, because it's actually creating an immunogenic response in the cell. So if you start adding things like mistletoe, and you start adding some of these other immune boosting things, that will actually synergize really, really well. PARP inhibitors actually work really, really well with ferroptosis, because they help block that XCT antiporter. I didn't know that when I did my ferroptosis module, but the PARP inhibitor is like brilliant, because, and that's the reason it works so well, is because it's working on ferroptosis. So that's, you know, and if you look at Jackie Beltray, I don't know if you know, she's a Sky Sports presenter in the UK. And she had stage 4, very bad. And she was taking artemisinin and iron at the same time, but she was kind of making herself worse because she wasn't doing it properly. So the artemisinin is brilliant because that helps the iron release oxygen, but she was taking too much iron, not enough artemisinin. She was going downhill fast. And then they gave her a PARP inhibitor. And shortly after, she talked to me, and I said, right, let's just stop what you're doing, take the iron out, because she'd had too much iron at this point. And I said, right, no more iron, you've got enough iron, and let's just give you things to promote ferroptosis with the PARP inhibitor. And literally within about 5 weeks, 6 weeks, she was completely clear. Amazing. Yeah, so she was, she had it everywhere, you know, so it's quite possible to get a really fast turnaround if you can get these things right. It's actually really, you know, it's quite stunning actually, the results that you can get. So I'm really hoping that I can get this ferroptosis clinic up and running, and we can get this instigated a bit more regularly with, you know, and I think the PARP inhibitors are particularly useful for it. So if you have the opportunity of getting a PARP inhibitor, particularly olaparib, get it, because I think it really helps.
What is it called? I'm sorry.
Olaparib. Olaparib, and they give it for BRCA 1 or 2, but actually they're starting to realize it has effects even if you're not BRCA positive.
And that's over the counter or prescribed?
No, it's prescribed. It's a prescribed drug. But yeah, it's it really has a beneficial effect with the ferroptosis protocol, because it's partly doing that already, and you just add on other things like the artemisinin, the, you know, all the other things that I talk about in my ferroptosis protocol, like the ashwagandha, the danshen, EGCG. Olaparib, you want me to spell that?
Yeah.
Olaparib.
I think half the battle, and we've talked about this a lot in our group sessions, is that the regular oncologists that we see don't want to prescribe these things, right? And it's, for someone like myself, I don't really go to my primary care physician for much because I don't really need to. I see my oncologist, and so, I mean, just going and saying, can you please prescribe this? I mean, what is your recommendation?
Yeah, well, olaparib, if you're BRCA1 and you can get it, I would absolutely encourage you to try and, use it as a drug, but use it alongside myoptosis protocol. It really has I've seen it. It works really well. So definitely have a go at that. But yeah, it is, but that's a traditional drug. And it is a non-traditional drugs, which we are obviously struggling with, all of us, to get, our doctors to investigate and to look at. We talk about side effects. Okay, right. Taking off label drugs and side effects. Side effects can be a major block to all sorts of success, really, because if you're getting nausea, if you're getting nausea is a big thing, and that can just put you off taking your drugs completely. And then if your liver enzymes go off the scale, sometimes it's not the off-label drugs, it's the traditional drugs, but because you're taking the off-label drugs, they'll take you off everything. And that's a big problem. You don't need to necessarily come off everything. Metformin, you should be able to take quite happily. You don't have to come off that if you've got liver enzymes going off the scale. But atorvastatin, you might well have to, and then introduce that slowly. Very often, once the enzymes have come back down again, you can reintroduce things. So you don't feel you have to stop it and that's it. And I see people going backwards with their results when they have side effects and they've had to come off things because they've been told to stop everything. And I don't think that's necessarily right. You can still carry on with quite a lot of supplements. You can carry on with, quite a few of the drugs, particularly things like metformin. And it's well worth trying to persevere, even, like I said, even if you've got diarrhea and things like that, take things that will help, like Imodium, manage those side effects as best you can to try and get through and get your body to a point where you can actually tolerate these things, because very often your body eventually adjusts and learns to accept it. But it's, you can go through a bit of rubbish times in the meantime, and certainly nausea is a really bad one. And there is a drug, and I've mentioned it in a blog before, called aprepitant, or aprepitant, some people call it, and it's an anti-nausea drug that they normally use during chemo, but it's got huge effects for blocking glycolysis, and I think it's a really useful one. They're using it in the CUSP-9 trial for glioblastoma, and they're getting great effects for that. So as part of a cocktail, it can be really useful. And they used it in a lady with very late stage breast cancer. She was sent home to hospice, and all they gave her was aprepitant, and she stayed alive for about another year just on aprepitant in a hospice, being told she had about a week or so to live. So it's important to know there are those drugs out there that have those really important effects, and blocking those metabolic pathways is really, really key. Any other questions on any of...
I hit enter way too soon, so I apologize. Kind of going along with those, so is one managing at different supplements at different times? Because for example, at what point you're trying to get that stem cell, right? So would you at some point say, hey, I think I got it, or keep managing it differently? Or that's probably why you're in constant contact with someone managing different supplements as well. I don't know if that question makes sense.
So you're thinking about sort of doing a chop and change sometimes with sort of how you change up your supplements to try and block different pathways at different times? Or
yeah, would you be
people do that.
constantly, yeah, on
Yeah,
the
some
same
people do
ones,
that.
or- okay.
But it isn't necessarily the way forward. You know, I would say if you're a HER2 positive and you know that it's going to be using macropinocytosis as a salvage pathway, you use Herceptin, the cancer's going to say, right, I'll just use macropinocytosis instead. You need to be blocking that. You've got to block that. Now, Sheree Skyle, who is now NED, she used loratadine and black seed oil as two things to block that, but hydroxychloroquine, I'm not too fond of hydroxychloroquine, so if you can get away with just using black seed oil and loratadine to block that, then great, terrific, you know. But again, you've got to stop those if you're going to do a kill phase with intravenous vitamin C. So it is swapping and changing a little bit. It does make your cocktail just that little bit more complicated, but I would say, generally speaking, don't mix it up. You know, you need to have a fairly comprehensive blocking program most of the time. You can afford to swap and drop some things if you're doing that pulse of oxidation. But generally speaking, you want to be blocking multiple pathways pretty much all the time. But again, you just got to work out what, you know, it's a little bit of self-management. You've got to work it out for yourself. Everybody's slightly different. Your gut microbiomes are different. Your aggressiveness of the cancer is different. The way you react to things, you know, we're all different and we have very different biological setups. So we're all going to sort of react slightly differently to different supplements, and you just got to work out what suits you and what doesn't. So, you know, you take what you can, and then you've got to be your own master of the orchestra, really. You've got to work out what works with what. So unfortunately, it does come down to the individual ultimately to try and do what you feel is best. And actually, you take the things that really speak to you. You know, I was given a whole list of things by Dr. Calaboo, and I cherry picked because I did my research. I looked into it and I thought, okay, well, I think that works better for me. That works better for me. And I actually kind of worked. He gave me so many things to take, and I couldn't possibly have managed them all. So I actually sort of cut it down to the ones that I felt were the most appropriate for me. That makes any sense?
It makes a lot of sense. This has been so helpful. Really, really appreciate you taking the time, Jane. Is there any more questions from those left in the audience? No. Well, there may be a few follow-up questions. Jane, I know that lots of ladies are looking forward to viewing this recording, so I might be back in touch via email.
No problem. No problem. Okay. All right. Lovely. Lovely to speak to you, Gillian. Okay. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye.